This is the church Castello. A Carmelite church built in the 17th century, 15th century, excuse me, and I think updated in the 17th century. The most interesting thing about it, other than that rough facade, and I don't know if that rough facade was for the purpose of someday putting a face on it, I don't know. But I think what's pretty are those buttresses, if you will, those arched buttresses. Another view of the Arno, which this church is next to. And that's the bridge I just crossed a few minutes ago. There you can see the tower on the Palazzo Vecchio next to Uffizi Museum, and there, just poking its dome above the surface, above those buildings, is the Duomo and Giotto's tower. And then this church, I think, is Ornasanti, which I ought to go look at. I don't know much about the tower. And this thing has something to do with fish. I don't know what that means. Whether it was just designed to dam up the river. There's one here and one further up on the other side of the Ponte Vecchio, just so there would always be water there and it'd be pretty. I don't know, but obviously it must slope downward from right to left. But it has the word fish in it, which means it has something to do with fishing, I guess. Like I know. Interesting little cupolas built in there on the side, perhaps to give light to chapels. If you get hungry, you just stop in one of the many, many, many places to get a bite. This is a little kind of a cookie thing that's almost like foam. I don't speak Italian, but she assured me, I'm confident, that there's no sugar, no fat in this. Completely healthy. I'm in the cloister of the Church of Carmine, where I'm here to go to the Bonacci Museum. This is a very pretty and very majestic cloister, although simple walls except for the frescoes at those ends that we can see. But notice how much more interesting this is than the one we were in yesterday. As you can see, this is a very dark cathedral or church. Certainly under natural light. Amazingly and most curiously, this museum or this church allows video without flash. This first is one of the most famous and pivotal works by Masaccio, depicting for the first time in 1,000 years realism in the faces and in the body movements and the emotions, the shame of Adam, the horrific realization of Eve that they are cast now out of paradise. This was all brand new. It's important to understand in this cathedral, or in this chapel in particular, these works are done by Masolino, who was a 40-year-old contractor. And Masaccio, a 29-year-old, who Masolino hired simply because Masolino was too busy to live up to his own commitment. Masolino painted as a classical trained artist. That is his version of Adam and Eve in paradise. And notice that here is created a symbol that will be used by others, including, I think, Michelangelo, and that is that the snake is in fact not only a woman, because women are likes and likes attract, but has also the same face as Eve. The brilliance of Masaccio is that he was an intuitive painter. And what's most important was that his sense of perspective, which we'll see, I think, a little bit later, was equally intuitive and not yet defined mathematically to other painters by Brunelleschi's work. This famous fresco is a tribute to taxpayer. It's actually, now a thing to notice, it's actually 3 stories in one, which is a common feature of this kind of work. But on the right is the taxpayer, as well as in the middle, and slightly in orange, is back to us. He is demanding a tribute from Jesus. Jesus says, fine, points to Peter and says to Peter, go get him some tribute. Peter goes over, and this is the third of 3 of the scenes, kneels down after he takes off his cloak and pulls a coin from the fish's mouth. And then in the far scene to the right, Peter is giving the tribute to the taxpayer. There are critics who consider this to be the first real painting, real in the sense of the humanist realism of the Renaissance, depicting real characters doing real things with real emotions. This scene depicts Peter baptizing. Notice the realism of the man on the right. His arms crossed, kind of shivering, either in the cold of the temperature or in anticipation of the cold water being baptized on him. This scene depicts a man who, in theory, has sold all of his wealth to give it to the Carmelite church, whose doctrine is to give to the poor, but then has withheld a certain amount of money. And Peter says to him, the people do not know that you have withheld the money, but God does. And shortly after, the man died. This famous panel by Masaccio is illustrating how Peter heals with just his mere shadow. The face of Peter and to his right John are devoid of anything other than concentration. And as their shadow falls, here the man very, very hopeful, the others starting to rise up, the third man having risen, having been healed by Peter. Notice the kneeling type of armrest that this poor man has. This lower panel was done by Filippo Lippi, who was prone to jam everything he could in. This is the crucifixion of Peter. Notice the background, though, through that arch. And notice that it gives us perspective. The figures are smaller. Notice the lines of the doorway and the arch indicating that linear perspective was well understood. Here's the sadism of that era. This upper scene is by Masolino, and it represents 2 different stories. The resurrection by Peter on the right of Tabitha, who had been prone to, in her sickness, giving goods to the poor, and then she died and he raised her up. And then on the left, healing that sick man. These apparently are two instances of biblical stories that occurred in different places at different times, but Masolino puts them here in his contemporary Florence, and making it contemporary with little knickknacks such as monkeys crawling around on the ledges up there, as well as clothing hung out over the edge, all of which apparently would have been typical of his contemporary. And notice the perspective, of course, represented in these arches, and again on this simple building. In this portion of Masaccio's painting, he's portrayed Brunelleschi on the right, I think Lorenzo Ghiberti in the center, himself, and then I'm not sure who that is. Masolino maybe is the small character that you don't even notice, just to the lower left of the man who's looking at us. An interesting story about this: it was not completely finished, I think for various reasons, one of which may have been that someone had died. But at any rate, the family that was originally in here, and this panel reflects the resurrection of the king's dead son, I think it is. But the family that had this made, this chapel, fell into great disfavor and was declared a rebel and cast out of Florence. And so his family was removed, and these characters were put back in, these being apparently prominent people of the day of Masolino. And again, this scene represents more than one event, this being the enthronement of St. Peter. This, by Masolino, is Peter preaching. And apparently Masolino and Masaccio were both, if not disciples, certainly ones who were influenced by Giotto, and Giotto's simple use of simple devices to illustrate emotions. For example, the preaching power of Peter is not evident in what Peter's doing, his upright hand, but rather in the faces of the individuals that are listening. The man in deep contemplation, the what looks like a nun in rapt attention in what he's saying, as is the case with the others. This altarpiece is an anonymous piece, don't even know the date, but it's classic 14th century, i.e. the 1300s, medieval. Notice the iconic look of both Jesus, his almost warped out of proportion head to body. Nothing about Mary is significant. One final thought. It's said that Leonardo da Vinci believed that Giotto and Masaccio were the two key elements that jump-started the Renaissance, or at least personified its beginning. There's something novel about bathrooms and sometimes showers in Italy, is they have an alarm cord in case there's an emergency. And here's some kind of a bidet equivalent, but no longer in use. These are what I think are perhaps some relatively recent, I don't know, paintings don't think they're frescoes. Somewhat discolored by mildew, I think, here. This one's nicely preserved. The large, huge figures of the central figures may indicate that they're important religious personages, and the people that are to the left that are smaller may indicate that they are less important, or maybe some attempt to indicate distance. And in fact, looking at that bit of damaged portion there on the right, it may well be that these are frescoes. And I think I can detect here about a half an inch of depth. So the fresco could be anywhere from 3/8 to a half an inch in thickness, I think. Perhaps all of these archways were once painted, but then became so damaged that rather than try to restore them, they simply painted over them. Notice that that served as a gutter, and probably still does. There's a small little drainage hole there. Another scene here, curiously, on board ship, and at the top it says VINC something, whatever that might mean. Probably, again, relatively recent, last couple of centuries. Notice the perspective of the foreshadowing of this knee poking right out at us versus the man. Seems all pretty much realistic. Same here with this man's foot. Not quite precise. Cold enough to see your breath, but yet those pink flowers prevail.